She was the oldest of 18 children when her mother died in childbirth. Unlike her sisters who married at the age of 15, my grandmother chose to avoid her mother's fate and remain single. She was now left to tend the farm and raise her siblings while her father continued to work in the deep woods. Lumberjacks made more money than subsistence farmers. Some of the older children raised the little ones as their own, and she reluctantly married a persistent suitor who, like her father, also worked as a lumberjack. This was the norm in Canada during the 1800s. To attract European immigrants to the harsh and densely wooded region of New Brunswick, the government subsidized large tracts of land and awarded a stipend to the head of household for the birth of every child who survived infancy. After the birth of her fourth child, my grandmother recognized her body had become a commodity to her husband and her country. Perhaps dreams of a better life helped her endure the long periods of isolation while her husband was away, and his wanton behavior when he returned. For she knew deep down in her heart that a woman's worth is greater than the pleasures of her body or the labors of her womb. That winter, she strengthened her resolve, and when her husband returned from the woods in the spring and reached for her, her heart cried out, "Pas un autre enfant," not one more child. Once he was asleep, she sat by the fire and wrote to her brother, "Meet me by the river on the night of the next full moon." When the time was right, she woke the two older children and bundled up the little ones. She grabbed her wool coat with the youngest in her arms, looked back on the life she created with her husband, and closed the door behind her. She followed the children out to the barn where she had hidden a hope chest of provisions for the journey. She strapped the chest to a sled, threw a horse blanket over it, and sat the youngest child on top. The older children followed along as they made their way down to the river to meet her brother. Hesitant to help a woman leave her husband, and concerned for his sister's well-being in a foreign country, her brother reluctantly agreed to guide them safely across the frozen St. John River, which in some sections is as wide as 5 miles. Once in the U.S., she swore him to secrecy as they hugged goodbye and let the children play briefly in the snow while she watched him start back across the river. Perhaps she was worried for his safety, or wondered whether she would ever see him again. Perhaps she wondered how far she would get if he did not keep his promise. Or perhaps she simply did not anticipate the pain of separation as she slowly turned her back on her country to collect her children, make her way to the train station, and embark on a journey into the unknown. When she got off the train, she adopted a new surname from a mailbox, declared herself a widow to avoid detection and the threat of deportation. When her sister refused to give her and the children shelter, she walked through town until she came upon an abandoned storefront. She convinced the owner, who was an elderly widow, to accept what she could afford for rent. Then she made beds for the children on the stockroom shelves and converted the storefront into a small cafe where she served breakfast to the men on their way to the factories. My grandmother was a resourceful businesswoman who also capitalized on the sale of bootleg whiskey during Prohibition and survived the Great Depression. She purchased her first home with cash on the barrelhead, as it was done in those days, and earned an uncommon respect among the men and women of her day. My grandmother's story is a legend in our family. She's like the tiny frog who held fast to a vision of hope and made it to the mountaintop. Patrick Overton once said, "When you come to the edge of all the light you know and are about to step off into the darkness of the unknown, faith is knowing one of two things will happen. There will be something solid to step on, or you will be taught to fly." My grandmother's story continues to inspire me every day, and especially during my call to ministry. As the youngest of 4 and the only girl, my brothers were a lot like the other animals in the forest, who tried to discourage me when I announced my intention to enter seminary at the age of 50 and become a minister. "Are you crazy? Why incur such debt at this stage in your life? French people are not too bright, you know. Women can't be ordained." We were all raised Catholic. "And you're a lesbian, for crying out loud." After several conversations, they logically concluded I must be going through a change of life. I could not agree with them more. The spiritual awakening that preceded my call to ministry dramatically changed my life, and for that I am profoundly grateful. When we are asked, feel called to, or must release all that we hold dear, it is important to hold fast to a vision of hope. Rebecca Solnit says, "To be hopeful means to be uncertain about the future, to be tender toward possibilities, and to be dedicated to change all the way down to the bottom of your heart." I believe grace happens when our hearts are open and we remain tender toward possibilities. Sometimes the winds of grace take us to unexpected places that may enrich our lives and prepare us for what lies ahead. When I compared the cost of seminary in 2008 to my undergraduate degree education 30 years prior, I nearly pulled my application. But instead, I raised my sails and looked for the people who could help me solve the problem. I thought if there was some way to defray the cost of room and board, I could afford to pay my tuition. So I reached out to my minister and the school's financial aid office, and shortly after I hung up with the school, I received an email from a faculty member looking for a seminarian to serve as a live-in caregiver for her mother. The position came with free room and board, and the address was a 5-minute walk from school. The winds of grace are always blowing. Louise was a delightful 93-year-old woman who had recently broken her hip. She was a former educator who mentored me in many ways during my first year in seminary. Halfway through my first year, her health declined, and she died the following summer. During that time, I learned a lot about dependent care and hospice services. So halfway through my second year of seminary, when my own mother was diagnosed with metastatic cancer at the age of 87, I knew what to do. She wanted to die naturally in the comfort of her own home, so I took a leave of absence to be her live-in caregiver. I could not have guided my family through the dying process had I not cared for Louise the year before. The winds of grace are always blowing. Other times, the winds of grace assure us we are not alone. I remember a time as a social worker when I got into my car and noticed I had a flat tire. The roads were wet. I was dressed very much like this with the white pants. And I wasn't familiar with my new car yet. I remember feeling overwhelmed and tearful until I decided to raise my sails, to look up and get out of the car. A man I recognized as one of our clients was walking down the street toward me. He was a religious man diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He refused treatment and generally avoided people, talking only to himself in ways others seldom understood. So I was surprised when he stopped walking, stood beside me, looking at the flat tire, and he asked if I had everything I needed to change the tire, and apologized that he couldn't do it for me because he had a hernia and a bad back. But he offered to stay with me while I call AAA. Although I did not have AAA, a man with a debilitating mental illness gave me everything I needed in that moment to change the tire myself. The assurance that I was not alone. When I was finished, he helped me lift the flat tire into the trunk, something he couldn't have done on his own without injuring his back, and something I could have not done on my own without getting my clothes dirty. When I thanked him and emphasized how I could not have done it without him, he said, "Don't thank me, thank the man upstairs. I don't know how to do any of this stuff." He gave me his blessing and continued down the sidewalk talking nonsensibly to anyone but himself. In the 15 years I knew him, he was never that lucid with me again, though he always gave me his blessing. The winds of grace are always blowing. But how do we raise our sails and invite a universe of possibilities to present themselves to us? In metaphysics, the element of air represents spiritual energy. And according to Hebrew scripture, creation began with the divine breath, or ruach. Biblical scholars note how the pronunciation of the divine name Yahweh incorporates the breath as we inhale with the first syllable and exhale with the second. Yahweh. Yahweh. Is it any wonder then, when we are frightened or in despair, someone invariably asks us to breathe? Just breathe. Like the boy who goes below deck when the seas are rough, we succumb to our fear of the unknown or to those who would discourage us. Our chin drops to our chest, our breath becomes shallow, and we see only the ground beneath our feet. When we are gripped by fear or sorrow and confine ourselves below deck where the air is stagnant and stale, it is impossible for us to see the horizon. To move forward We must raise our heads, fill our lungs with fresh air, and remain tender to the possibilities. What's that song? When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. When we raise our sails, we prepare ourselves to catch the winds of grace. And with one hand on the tiller and a vision of hope in our heart as our true north, we are better equipped to navigate the seas of life. Whether it is the pursuit of a new vocation, a return to school, a change in geographic location, a decline in health, the birth of a child, the loss of a loved one, or a flat tire on a cold, wet day. May the winds of grace bring us ever closer to all that is good and life-giving in our lives and in the life of this beloved community. Blessed be.